get my shoes and out the door. 5, I'm alive. 6, 7, 8, feeling great.
Hello and welcome back to Beyond Your Wildest Genes podcast. My name is Dr. Noah DeCoyer and I am your co-host. Today our guest is Dr. David Seaman, the author of the DeFlame Diet. Deflame your diet, body, and mind. Dr. Seaman received a BS in biology and nutrition at Rutgers, then went to New York Chiropractic College. Shortly after graduating, 30 years ago now, he took classes that delved more deeply into pain mechanisms and realized that food-related chemicals cause inflammation and stimulate pain fibers, nociceptors. Dr. Seaman has written 2 books and many articles and book chapters on the topic of nutrition for pain and inflammation. He has taught this topic in several chiropractic college programs, including Palmer, National, and Logan. His most recent book is the DeFlame Diet, which was published in April of 2016. Thank you, Dr. Seaman, for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Listen, Dr. Seaman, you've been talking about inflammation and deflaming for years. The first time I realized it, and it's a magazine cover that we use all the time in our lectures, was the February 23rd, 2004 Time magazine cover, and the headline was Inflammation, the Silent Killer. Thoughts on this?
Yeah, that really kind of captured the issue, but then when they get into it in that book, or rather in that article, and in lots of other articles, they'll typically skirt around the real big hairy elephant gorilla in the middle of the room, and that is overeating sugar, flour, and the refined oils that sugar and flour are cooked in. And they get on to this, like, take fish oil, which is fine, do this, do that, but it's kind of any of those therapies are less effective if you're flaming away with, biting too many donuts and donut-like foods. But other than that, though, they were right on the money. And what people really should have taken from that is that Alzheimer's disease is basically atherosclerosis of the brain. Diabetes is Alzheimer's disease of the pancreas. Osteoarthritis is atherosclerosis of joints. And we can kind of go on and on because the chemistry of all these diseases are essentially identical, the difference being the parenchymal or structural tissues that the diseases occur in. So that's really the difference. So it can kind of like confuse what one should do for one disease versus the other, because the names are different and the tissues are different in terms of anatomy, but the biochemistry is virtually identical in all of those conditions.
Yeah, we're going to dive into that in 1 second, but just to set the stage and just for our audience to get a feel of who you are, how did you get into this topic? Because you're trained as a chiropractor, and first all chiropractors start off being trained in structure equals function, and then we branch off into different topics and different specialties. How did you end up here and where you are today?
Well, my undergraduate degree was in biology/nutrition, and I went through all the chemistry stuff, biochemical pathways and Krebs cycle and glycolysis numerous times, memorizing from glucose down to ATP numerous times, and how lipids got into the Krebs cycle, making ATP numerous times. And when I was in college, the biochem book that I used showed that there were nutrients that were required to drive these pathways. And then when I got into chiropractic college, I became a fan of trigger point therapy, and my favorite book, and it's still a favorite of mine in terms of historical significance for me, was Janet Travell and David Simon's book on trigger points. And they have a perpetuation chapter, and that perpetuation chapter, half of it is about nutrition. And so I started, look at this, nutrition and muscle pain. So that kind of intrigued me when I was in chiropractic college. And then shortly after graduating, I took a postgrad class that was taught by a fairly famous, deceased now, British medical doctor whose career was basically looking at joint pain, joint neurology, articular neurology. And he was a friend to physical therapists, manual therapists of all kinds, be they physiotherapists, massage therapists, historical bone setters, or chiropractors. And his name is Dr. Barry Wyke, W-Y-K-E, not to be confused with Barry White, the Ally McBeal singer dude. So I so I took this class with him like I don't know, maybe a year after I graduated. So that's like almost 30 years ago, and he went over the pain system in a fashion where I could actually sit back and not have to worry about a test or the next hour going to a different class or whatever it might be. I sat there for 12 or 15 hours, and he basically made it very, very clear that our body chemistry is perhaps the most profound influencer of our pain system's activity and its stimulation. And that really kind of got me going. And I started to look at nutrition from the perspective of its ability to produce the chemicals that Dr. White laid out. And that was back in like 1987 or so. So I've been doing this and hunting for information for 30 years now. So when I read that article in Time Magazine and some of the other books that came out about inflammation and diet, I'm like, geez, I should have got this book out earlier. I mean, I was teaching postgrad classes to chiros on this topic in 1992, and I didn't get my book out until 2016. I'm a little bit late to the show, even though I was there in the beginning.
Better late than never. So
that's true.
Let's go there. How about starting this conversation with the difference between acute inflammation versus chronic inflammation? Because they both have their importances, but I don't know if everybody really understands the difference between both of those types.
Well, when you take a biology class or a physiology class, the topic of inflammation is discussed, and it's always described in the context of a post-injury chemical response that involves swelling, redness, heat, and pain, and that response is required for healing to occur, and that's all absolutely true. The problem is when inflammation is quiet, and it's typically called in the kinds of the term chronic is usually used for the quiet version, where there is no swelling, there is no redness, there is no heat, there's no identifiable presence of inflammation. And that is what takes place within vessel walls for heart disease and in the pancreas for type 2 diabetes, and even in tendons for tendinopathy and joints for osteoarthritis. It's a more silent kind of quiet version until enough tissue has been damaged so as to bring out symptoms. And the symptoms are typically brought out in a fashion that does not alert us to the previous 10, 20, 30 years of self-abuse in a moderate fashion, as we call it. Well, I only smoke a little bit. I only eat a couple of donuts a day. I haven't exercised in 5 years, but I walk a little bit. All those things are pro-inflammatory. Over time, they manifest in this chronic state that then is associated with chronic disease expression. So one is quiet and silent until it expresses itself, and the other is robust and obvious after a typical injury. And the chronic version is the one associated with diet, even though, interestingly, even though if you eat a donut, your body will undergo an acute response, an inflammatory response to the food, but it will be silent to your symptoms. So it's really kind of a paradoxical situation.
Interesting. And before we really dive into diet, how does inflammation, because I know this is where you really studied, particularly in your early years, how does inflammation relate to pain?
Well, when you think about the neurology of pain, and most practitioners, and this involves whether it would be a chiropractor, a medical doctor, osteopath, physical therapist, it really doesn't make any difference. We all learn basic pain mechanisms from a physiology book. And physiology books, they don't really get into the detail of how these pain fibers, or properly called nociceptors, are stimulated. So the way it works is, for example, prostaglandins are probably one of the better known inflammatory chemicals. And for the listening audience who says, I'm not sure what a prostaglandin is, people take aspirin, Tylenol, Aleve, Motrin, Celebrex. People take those medications to turn off the production of prostaglandins. Now, the way prostaglandins cause pain is they stimulate a specific prostaglandin receptor on the pain fiber. And so if we didn't have prostaglandin receptors, we wouldn't have pain from prostaglandins, but we'd have pain from other chemicals. Now, the problem with prostaglandins is that their balance of production in the body is dependent on the types of fats that we eat. And this is where people have an urge to consume fish oil, for example, because fish oil is anti-inflammatory, and one of the beneficial effects of fish oil is the reduction of this pro-inflammatory, pain-stimulating prostaglandin, and instead a greater production of an anti-inflammatory, non-pain stimulating prostaglandin.
Gotcha. Perfect. So that's a perfect segue into food. What are some examples of how diet can promote inflammation, or that chronic or that silent inflammation in your body?
Well, let's just say that somebody decides that they're going to avoid eating vegetables and eat sugar, flour, refined oils, and then, let's look at, I guess another way to look at it would be, what does the average American eat? About maybe 10% of their calories comes from vegetables, fruit, nuts, and beans. And whole grains are the least healthy of your whole foods. The lion's share of calories in the average American's diet comes from sugar, flour, and refined oils, and about 10% from milk, and maybe 15-20% from meat. So the average person just eats basically meat and bread and pasta and sugar, flour desserts and donuts and those types of things. So when we eat those foods, there is an immediate inflammatory reaction that occurs. When you're young, you don't feel anything. And when you're young and when you're busy running around, you don't get any weight gain. And then when people continue to eat that way in college, and now in college they're sitting a lot more because they're in class, and then they study, and then at night they're studying, they're eating, and so they're spending a lot more time being sedentary, eating the same amount of calories from the same foods, they start to put on body fat. And the accumulation of body fat from those calorie sources is the easiest way to identify that one is flaming up, as I call it. So body fat gain is a manifestation of low-grade inflammation developing. So that is one example. And the average person in America, well, if 1 out of 3 Americans is normal weight, and 2 out of 3 are either overweight or obese, which means that 2/3 of the adult population, and now kids, of course, are heavy too. So 2/3 of the adult population are inflamed from the perspective of body weight. Now, when they're eating these calorie sources, and I call them calorie sources rather than food, because sugar, flour, and refined oils, that's not food. Food is stuff that is living either on the ground, running around in the woods, or grazing, or is growing in the ground, or swimming in the ocean. That's food. Sugar and flour, not growing, not food. Right. So when we eat these calorie sources, there is the bacteria in our intestines reacts to the sugar, flour, and refined oils to create a low-grade inflammatory reaction in the gut. And that low-grade inflammatory reaction in the gut is transferred due to the fact that the sugar, flour, as well as bacterial end products are absorbed into circulation, and so you get a low-grade inflammatory reaction every time we eat those foods. When we overeat those foods, we gain weight. And so when it goes on over time, the sugar and flour will drive the inflammation, and then eating too much omega-6 fatty acids from the refined oils, as in deep-fried food, that will change the anatomy of our cell membranes and make them pro-inflammatory, so that now our cells in our body, all the ones that are produced after we get into this overeating inflammatory food state, all the cells in our body then take on a molecular signature, a molecular anatomy of inflammation. And this goes on over time. And then eventually we start not to feel well. Like, I don't like it. I'm a little fatigued. I'm achy. I'm tired. A little depressed. All of those symptoms, which are very common in young adults, is a manifestation of chronic inflammation. It's due to overeating sugar, flour, refined oils, and not eating vegetables, fruits, tubers like sweet potatoes, nuts, and legumes.
Dr. Seaman, at first glance, it's in your book, and at first glance, it astounded the percentage astounded me. You said 60% of the American diet is flour, sugar, and refined. And it seems kind of astounding. But then when you think about what the average person eats, an average person wakes up, has a cup of coffee with milk and sugar and a bagel. For lunch, they have a sandwich with some cheese and some cold cuts, and then for dinner, they have pasta and garlic bread. Right? Like that's the average.
There you go. And dessert, and you got for a dessert in there, yeah.
Right, and that's
and soda,
a little bit of and soda.
And don't forget soda. And if you're in the South, you got sweet tea. So the average American eats about 100 plus pounds of sugar a year.
Right. So at first glance, like I said, it looks a lot, but then you realize that it's not a lot. It's what everybody's doing, and then when you really look at all the biochemical processes, like you said, like your cell membranes literally becoming transformed because of this, you can understand why we're such an obese, sick, unhealthy nation, and getting sicker, by the way.
And to be fair, I also in the book I mentioned that is more about, I think about 56% or 55.6 or 57%, not 60% based upon one assessment. But I just rounded up to 60 because it's easier to remember. And because you and I aren't doing that, some guy out there is doing 70% or 80% to make up for us.
I know that's scary.
Yeah, it is scary.
Let's hit this. What foods inflame and which foods deflame?
Well, the chart of foods that deflame, people will see things like bacon and cream cheese and cream and heavy cream and think, how could that be? Well, you can't just drink heavy cream, but the point is if you're eating vegetables, those fatty foods are really irrelevant in the context of driving inflammation. People will think, well, meat is the bad thing, right? People will ask, probably you and certainly me, do you eat meat? Like as if meat is bad. The reason why is because when you look at a burger, you usually see it covered with dripping with cheese and a big bun and then French fries everywhere, and people will blame the burger and give the bun and the extra fries and the Coke and the shake and the apple thing afterwards that's full of sugar, the apple pie thing. And they don't criticize that, but those all get the pass, but the meat gets criticized. So it's not so much what which foods actually do it. It's better to look at it in the context of which foods lead to a post-eating surge of sugar associated with fat. And the biggest issue is sugar. So it's really sugar and flour do this. So if you decide to put, again, a big old burger on top of a donut, well, you're kind of adding fat and protein to sugar, flour, and fat. And in that context, the added calories becomes a problem. So really it's about calories. If one overeats calories, they will gain weight. Now, the key is that I could eat pounds and pounds of cheese and become obese and inflamed. So one has to control their calories first. And the easiest way to control calories is to, overeat, in quotes, overeat vegetables. Like a head of romaine lettuce is 100 calories. The average person, looks at a small size salad as, eating vegetables. And that's like maybe 2 leaves from a head of romaine lettuce and represents about maybe 10 calories, 20 calories. So one has to eat several hundred calories per day of vegetation. So that needs to be the way to look at it, overeating vegetation from one's current eating pattern. And that means eating pounds of vegetation per day. I'll often eat 2 pounds of broccoli in one sitting. And people, that's a lot. Not really. 2 pounds of broccoli is like 225 calories, 250 calories. So one has to overeat vegetables and then taking calories from potatoes and nuts. And if you do that, you're kind of stuffed, and there's no way you're going to drink a gallon of heavy cream or eat a pound or 2 of cheese. So the foundation should be vegetation to which we add our animal products. I think that's probably the best way to look at it rather than picking out which food will inflame me, which food will deflame me, because it has to be taken in the context of overall calorie intake.
Yeah, I had a little bit of a hard time looking at that too. I eat essentially paleo slash primal. I've done that for nearly 5 years. Um, I had a hard time looking at the calories thing for a while, and then I finally realized that the way my one works is the bulk has to be vegetables or vegetation. Ultimately, the bulk of the calories are probably going to come from healthy fats, because just calorie wise, that's just the way it is. A tablespoon of fat is like 200 calories, and like you said, you need to eat 2 pounds of broccoli to get 200 calories. And
Isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy?
it's insane to me, but that's the way I had to look at it to really understand this, because you could essentially, it's almost impossible to eat 2,000 calories of vegetables a day. It would be a hell of a lot of vegetables, that's for sure.
You cannot do it. And so the biggest hurdle for people to overcome, and the paleo diet issue is a problem for people too, because people misinterpret paleo. For example, just a real quick bit on that. Paleo is is historical eating based upon the foods that were available in your local environment.
Right.
So if I was from Florida, my paleo diet in Florida back in 1700 would be very different than my paleo diet in Saskatchewan in 1700, because different animals and different vegetation grows in these very, very different locations. It gets even more crazy if you think about the Arctic Circle, where the primary calorie source would be seal meat, like 80% fat, and you go down to New Guinea, where they have virtually no chronic diseases, and their primary calories are sweet potatoes, taro, yams, and fruit, and they're free of disease. So paleo is really eating what is local to your own environment. But now what people have done is they think, well, fat is bad, and fruit. People are now afraid of fruit, like fructose, fruit's bad, and they just don't eat enough calories, and they mostly eat protein, and then they feel terrible eating paleo because they get duped by all the other crazy fear mongering, water muddying things that are out there regarding fructose and fat. So yeah, your approach is smart to be paleo and primal. The thing about the paleo primal movement is that there should not be fat fear placed upon people, because eating fat is not a problem. Every study where people eat at their caloric needs or in slight deficit, but go into ketosis by eating lots of fat and virtually no sugar, no flour, and very low starchy carbohydrates, the outcome is health benefits across the board. Endurance, no loss in endurance, no loss in strength. And so the whole fat thing needs to be really better understood by the average person out there.
Yeah, and it's in your book, and you mentioned it already. Healthy fats are not the problem. They're only a problem in the context of excess omega-6 seed oils, in the context of excessive sugar, and in the context of excessive flour and wheat products.
Yeah, even saturated fats. People are terrified of saturated fats, and I always, and in the book, I wrote it this way because this is how I ask it in lectures, whether I'm talking to, it doesn't make a difference. I've done a lot of presentations this year to dental groups and a couple of medical groups last year. And I'm like, well, let's name some saturated fatty acids that are problematic. And virtually, we're so stupefied and live in fear of saturated fats, no one can even mention like one. Like, well, let's name a fatty acid. And so they're like, well, butter. I'm like, well, butter is a fat, and it's made up of fatty acids. Well, animal fat. Well, animal fat's animal fat. Name some saturated fatty acids that are going to kill you. And people just can't name any, because saturated fatty acids, in actual fact, are actually anti-inflammatory. Like 50% roughly of the fat in mother's milk is saturated. So if saturated fat is so bad, how come newborns are being fed a big dose of saturated fatty acids? And the reason why is because saturated fatty acids actually have profound antibacterial effects. So the whole thing is just a disaster, the way fat has been described to the modern population.
I personally think that alone has been the biggest dietary transgression has been placed on the public. Personally, when you've touched upon this already, every cell membrane in our body is made of fat. Mother's milk is all fat. Our brain is what, 60% DHA. I mean, it's so crucial, and yet the low-fat diet was just slammed down our throats. And finally, we're seeing a turn where people are realizing that was just wrong, wrong in every which way.
Yeah, very much wrong. Now, the only way it's right is if you throw a bunch of butter, like a whole tub of butter, on top of some white bread, or a whole tub of, or a whole tub of butter on top of a burger. Well, then it's because now you have too many calories, and too many calories are a problem no matter what your calorie source is. If you could actually eat 5,000 calories per day of romaine lettuce, that would make you sick because there is a calorie limit, but no one can do that with vegetation.
Right. Now, your book is heavy on eating whole foods to achieve this deflamed state, and it's also not disease specific. You clearly say that your goal should be to reach this deflamed state consistently and persistently, because that's going to limit your chances of all the diseases. But you do talk about specific supplementation to help support this action of deflaming. You care to list a few of those?
Yeah, it's very simple, actually. It's kind of funny because people always want, well, I have XYZ. What do I need to take for XYZ? And to me, XYZ is just a different name for a condition associated with a particular tissue that happens to be almost identical to other tissues, only they just do different overall functions, but their biologic needs are the same. So that boils down to a multivitamin, magnesium, fish oil, vitamin D as the basics. And to that you can add a probiotic. And if the average person just did those five, you can do more, of course. And if one wanted to do more, then the next two that one should move toward would be CoQ10 or lipoic acid. They have similar functions. And then spices like ginger and turmeric and boswellia. Those supplements are magnificent for most conditions because they all have an anti-inflammatory effect. And I didn't mention calcium because calcium is over supplemented. Calcium has been just jammed down people's throats at the expense of other nutrients. In fact, one of the most important minerals that we need that is not even mentioned ever is potassium. And I've got a chapter on potassium in the book. And you really can't supplement with potassium because you need to take it with food so it breaks down and gets absorbed slowly so you don't have a cardiovascular response. But potassium is found in green vegetables as the most concentrated source. So potassium is actually one of the key nutrients that sits there in bony tissue and prevents bone loss. So I know I just dove off from supplementation to potassium, but that's because people they're freaked out about their cholesterol levels and how much calcium they should be taking. Well, those are the exact things not to be focusing on. What to be focusing on would be like the cover of my book that shows washing away the French fries and white bread and cupcakes and desserts, replacing them with vegetables, and then add to that magnesium, fish oil, vitamin D, and if you want a probiotic, ginger, turmeric, and then CoQ10 or lipoic acid as examples.
Yeah, after reading your book, I had a little bit of a different perspective on potassium, which was interesting for me, and I hope some people will purchase the book and read that small chapter, but really interesting. The other two supplements you mentioned there that really interest me. One is the spice turmeric or turmeric, however you say it. It seems to have incredible health benefits, just astounding, and the research out there is really heavy. And the other one is magnesium. I mean, as a practitioner, I carry three different types of magnesium in my office. One is just a standard magnesium. Another type of magnesium that helps people with headaches. It's a specific formulation. And another one that helps people have more regular bowel movement. So magnesium to me is totally astounding as well.
Yeah, it's actually shocking when someone can just take, and the typical dose that the average person or the typical recommended dose for magnesium is about 400 milligrams per day. Some can do more depending upon what their condition is. My brother suffers from cervical dystonia, real cervical dystonia, the spasmodic torticollis, and he has taken up to 2,000 milligrams of magnesium per day with no diarrhea effect. And the reason why is because magnesium is depleted from the body with stressful states. So people can tolerate varying degrees of magnesium, but the average person, once they get up to 400 milligrams per day or more, they're like, I feel more energy. I feel less depressed. My bowel movements are better. I'm sleeping better. I mean, it's really, because it's involved with over 200, 300 reactions in the human body. Magnesium. No one knows that. It's always about calcium.
Right. Now, I think the answer is pretty obvious, but who can benefit from your book?
Well, yeah, it is pretty obvious. Really, everybody. And the book is written in a fashion so that I think people who have you need probably at least a high school education to get through most of the book. There's one chapter that's a little complicated, but that's just is required because you have to have a science chapter. But anybody who wants to feel better and make diet and nutrition simple, because our brains have a hard time focusing on water muddying concepts, and something that is simple as inflammation is bad and drives disease. We want to go the other way and deflame. So this means that every time we sit down to eat or drink, we need to ask ourselves, will this inflame me or deflame me? And if you look at the foods that inflame versus deflame, the choice becomes really simple.
Yeah, I look at this book two ways. One, if you're just a regular health advocate, there's a couple chapters in the middle of the book that has some chemical structure compounds that's a little bit tough. The rest of it's really simple. But from a clinician, I don't read too much research articles, unlike yourself, which I think you read a lot of research articles. But there are more research articles listed in your book at the end of each chapter than I think I've seen in any book written that I've read, and I read all the time. So I think as a clinician, you can appreciate that as well about your book for sure.
Well, it's important to substantiate an approach because people have been hit with so many different dietary confusion topics. It's like it's terrible how confusing the whole is the whole area. So since you're kind of a paleo primal guy, well, properly done, a paleo primal diet is anti-inflammatory. Properly done, Atkins diet is anti-inflammatory.
Right. So
if one just focuses on the physiologic effect, because you really can't like primal yourself, but you can deflame yourself. So the terminology is beneficial for the mind in terms of identifying what the food choice will do in that moment and long term.
Can't agree and more. Any last words, Dr. Seaman?
No, I'm good.
Yeah, I am too, and I think so is our audience. My name is Dr. Noah DeCoyer, your co-host, and you are listening to the Beyond Your Wildest Genes podcast. If you like what you've heard today, please share this with your friends and family and encourage them to subscribe on iTunes. Giving us a 5-star rating would be the icing on the cake. Believe it or not, this helps us reach more people. You can sign up for our incredible weekly email at www.beyondyourwildestgenes.com. All the appropriate links, including our 3 free ebooks, can be found in the show notes. Thank you, Dr. Seaman, and as my oldest son Hayden says, be awesome and never unawesome.
Thanks.